Good afternoon again. Our next session is by Kristie Kendall, and she's going to be presenting on the Peter Hitt Farm, uncovering 2 centuries of history on the Rappahannock River. Kristie has served on the board of the Germanna Foundation since January 2016. And since 2011, she's worked with the Piedmont Environmental Council. She also serves as on the Historic Preservation she serves as the Historic Preservation Coordinator. She currently sits also on the Fauquier County Architectural Review Board. She's very interested, and her preservation work is in representing the underrepresented communities in Virginia, in the Virginia Piedmont, including mountain settlements in Virginia along the Blue Ridge Mountains, the free, Black, and post-emancipation communities of Virginia. So without further ado, here's Kristie. Thank you, Kristie.
So many of you may have heard us talk about the Peter Hitt Farm. This is a property that was acquired by the Germanna Foundation in 2 parcels between 2007 and 2017. This is actually a drone image of the property, and the red lines that you can see roughly show the boundaries of the property. This was gifted to the foundation in 2007. This northern portion with the cemetery was gifted, and then in 2017, this lower portion, including the log house and frontage along the Rappahannock River, this was gifted by the Hitt Foundation of the late Russell Hitt. So the property includes the cemetery and the burial site of Peter Hitt, a log house, and a number of other unique features that we'll talk in more detail today during the presentation. For those of you who are familiar with Fauquier County, the property that we're talking about, the Hitt Farm, is located in extreme western Fauquier County. It's sort of due west of the town of Warrenton and right along the Rappahannock River. The foundation knew that this property was connected to Peter Hitt, the grandson of the immigrant Peter Hitt, when it acquired the property in 2017. But aside from that, there was not a lot of information to go off of regarding the story of the property and the people connected to it. So over the last 2 years, I've delved very deeply into documentary research on the property to uncover what I think is a pretty unique story that can teach us about a number of different things, including the interactions of various ethnic groups, English, German, African, a look into leaseholding practices on the frontier, changes in farming practices over time, historic construction techniques, so many things. What I developed was a research for framework that attempted to answer several questions that I thought were sort of the most pressing. The first being, what is the connection to Peter on the river? So in the historical record, there are numerous Peter Hitts, and one of them is differentiated from the others as Peter on the river. We want to know what the connection to this property is with Peter on the river. Second, who lived here? I wanted to know as many people as possible as we could place on this property historically. Third, when was the log house on the property built? So when the foundation acquired the property in 2017, there was this beautiful log house that you'll see pictures of in a minute. I wanted to get a solid construction date for the house. Fourth, who is buried in the cemetery? We knew that the Revolutionary War soldier Peter Hitt was buried in the cemetery, but who else was buried there? And then lastly, I really wanted to know how the property was used historically for farming and for other purposes. And what I'm going to be presenting today is really just the beginning of this research, which is still ongoing. So before we dive into answers to those questions I just shared, I wanted to provide a little bit of context for the Hitt family and in which branch of the Hitt family we're talking about. The first Peter Hitt, the immigrant, married Elsbeth Otterbach. And they were, of course, members of the group of 42 German men, women, and children who arrived in Virginia in 1714 and settled at Fort Germanna. They had a son named John Hitt, and John and his wife Mary had a son named Peter Hitt. Now, it is this Peter Hitt, or Peter on the River, that we will be discussing today. So John Hitt, the son of Peter and Elsbeth, as I mentioned, was born at the fort about 1715. And as we know, the group didn't remain in the area long. By 1721, they had moved to land near what is present-day Midland and Fauquier County, and it was historically known as Germantown. John Hitt acquired 217 acres of land from his brother, Joseph Hitt, in March 1745, and it's here that his son Peter, or Peter on the River, was born in 1755 or thereabouts. Peter Hitt married Hannah James in 1783 at Turkey Run Church. And Turkey Run Church was actually built on a portion of the Hitt family's land. And for location purposes, anyone familiar with the town of Warrenton, this property that we're talking about is actually just southeast of where the town is located currently. So this Peter on the River, we figured out how he's connected to the immigrant Peter Hitt, but now we need to figure out how he came to be connected to the Hitt Farm property that the foundation owns. When researching a property, there are a whole host of sources to consult to help answer questions and uncover stories about people and places. And this is a list of some of the sources that I relied on in this project, and several of them I'll go into more deep detail about today. So one of the first projects that I took on was compiling a chain of title for the property. As you can see, there's quite a few succession of owners over time. I started out with the Hitt Foundation donating the land to the Germanna Foundation in 2007, and then I chained the ownership back to Lord Thomas Fairfax in 1781. At that time, the property was part of a 21,000 acre holding. The next transfer, though, wasn't until 1816, and that was to a James Markham Marshall, as you can see here. And that property was still part of a massive land holding. Plus, that date was after the death of Peter Hitt, who died in 1802. So that didn't help place Peter Hitt on the land. This map shows the boundaries of the Marshall family's land holdings in the Manor of Leeds from that 1816 date that I just mentioned through 1855. And in orange, you can see the location of the Hitt Farm in relationship to the property boundaries. So I couldn't connect Peter Hitt to the property through land ownership. But remembering that this area was part of the Manor of Leeds, made up mostly of leaseholders until the mid to late 19th century, I realized I needed to go searching through those leases, which are thankfully also in the deed books of the courthouse. And there I found it. So this is an image of the lease agreement between Denny Martin, who is an heir of Lord Fairfax, and Peter Hitt. So Martin leased the land to Peter Hitt. It was a 200-acre tract of land along the Rappahannock River, and the lease date was February 5th, 1791. And there's quite a bit of detail we can glean from reading the lease and learning about this early period of occupation on the property. So we get information regarding the lot number for the lease, the acreage. The annual cost for leasing the land was 50 shillings, plus the cost of surveying, as well as annual land taxes. And there's some interesting details in the lease terms as well. The leaseholder was required to build a dwelling house that measured 24 feet by 16 feet, and it had to have either a brick or stone chimney. The leaseholder was also required to plant an orchard of at least 100 apple trees, and the lease was to run with the lives of 3 people. In this lease, it said Peter Hitt, Joseph Barnes, and Reuben Hitt. The lease was later renewed by Peter's wife, Hannah, in 1840, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So I started searching the leases back prior to 1791 because I thought it was potentially possible that someone had held a lease prior to Peter Hitt, and that perhaps someone even resided on the land prior to that 1790 period. And in fact, I found a lease from Lord Fairfax to John Hopper Sr., dated October 2nd, 1757. This was the same leased land as the land in Peter Hitt's lease. It contained 200 acres, and the terms were very similar. The cost was 40 shillings annually. The leaseholder was required to build, in this case, a quote, good and sufficient dwelling, but it didn't stipulate the size that the house had to be. The leaseholder also had to plant an orchard of 150 apple trees, and the lease was to run with the lives of 3 people: John Hopper, Ann Hopper, his wife, and Humphrey Hopper, his son. This map shows the boundaries of John Hopper's original 1757 lease and shows that the boundaries remained the same from 1757 all the way through Hannah Hitt's lease renewal in 1840. And in orange in the middle here, you can see the location of the 11.5 acres of the Hitt Farm that the Germanna Foundation owns today. So now that we've established the chain of title for the property, including leaseholders, that first question is answered. The question of what is the connection to Peter on the River? Well, this was his land lease. And the reason that he was referred to as Peter on the River is because he was Peter Hitt living on the Rappahannock River. And now that we have this list of tenants and landowners, we can start to do a deeper dive into the research of all of the people that lived on this land. But of course, that second question isn't as cut and dry to determine. Just because someone held a lease or owned the land doesn't automatically mean that they were living on the property. And finding records pertaining to the history of people's lives in the 18th century is notoriously difficult. Records were just not maintained in the manner that they are now. And what records do exist tell us very little about the actual lives of the people. So with respect to John Hopper Sr. and his family, I really just wanted to know whether or not they actually lived on this leased land. Fortunately, I found 2 references. The first reference was in the Fauquier County Road Orders from 1766, and the order references several individuals: Dixon Brown, John Hopper, Charles Jones, and Francis Jett. And it tells them to locate the path for a new road that would go from the Hedgemans River, which was an old name for the Rappahannock River, to the road leading from Leeds Manor to the courthouse. So this places John Hopper in the manor of Leeds near the Rappahannock River. I think it's safe to assume that he would have been living there by that time. The other reference was from a chancery case from 1855, in fact, and a number of people in the depositions of this chancery case attested to the fact that John Hopper and his wife Anne lived in a house on that leased land until John left for Kentucky in the 1790s. So the documentary record gives us enough information to show that during the mid to late 18th century, at least, John Hopper Sr., his wife Anne, and their son Humphrey Hopper lived on this property. And when I say the property in this context, I'm really talking about somewhere on that 200-acre lease. Anne, his wife, died and prior to John leaving for Kentucky, and would have been buried somewhere on the property. John left for Kentucky in the 1790s, as I just mentioned, and then his son Humphrey Hopper, it appears, stays in the area. And I couldn't locate additional information on any other children that they may have had. Evidence for Peter Hitt and his family being on the property was much easier to find. In fact, going back to that 1855 Hitt versus Smoot Chancery case, they're actually referenced numerous times, and people attested to the fact that the Hitt family lived on the same leased land as the Hoppers. And then furthermore, land tax records, and this is an example from 1821, show Hannah Hitt being assessed with 228 acres and an improvement value of $200. From about the turn of the 19th century until 1850 or so, we now know the Hitt family occupied the property, and this would have included Peter Hitt until his death in 1802, Hannah Hitt, his wife, until her death in 1846, along with their 10 children who I've listed here. The depositions in that Chancery case that I keep referencing because it's such a wealth of information, talk about a man named Henry Benier, who, and it says that he was living with the family for 2 seasons to help them build the chimneys on the house. He was apparently both a shoemaker and a stonemason. That same Chancery case also says that a man named Daniel Gladstone rented a portion of the property from Hannah Hitt in the 1840s and that he was growing corn and wheat. In Hannah Hitt's lease renewal of 1840, she lists 3 lives that the lease would run with after her death, and those being 3 of her grandsons, Jacob Hitt, Jonathan Freeman, and Thaddeus Smoot. So I think it's safe to assume that these families were either living on or they were living in close proximity to the Hitt farm at that time. The African-American presence on the property in the first half of the 19th century was a little more challenging to uncover. Peter Hitt's inventory from 1802 lists, quote, a Negro girl, Jude, and she was valued at 70 pounds. We can surmise from this valuation that she was almost certainly a teenager and that she was probably nearing childbearing age. In the 1810 census, there are 2 enslaved workers tabulated as living on the property. It's unclear, though, whether one of them could have been Jude or if Hannah Hitt purchased additional enslaved workers between 1802 and 1810. By the 1830 census, there is 1 enslaved male between the ages of 10 and 23 and 2 free Blacks, one between 10 and 23 and the other between 36 and 54. By the 1840 census, however, there are no enslaved workers or free Blacks tabulated on the property, and it's unclear where the enslaved male from the 1830 census went. So after the Hitt family leaves the property around 1850, there is just this giant question mark. We really don't know anything. There's roughly 2 decades of history on this property where there's no record of anyone living on or leasing the property, and it was still part of the massive Marshall land holdings at that time. By 1872, however, the Marshall family sells that 200-acre tract to 2 individuals, Craven Gore and Thornton Cornwell, who I believe were cousins. And they actually take that property and they split it in half. So Craven Gore and his wife, Sarah, who I've listed here, they take the portion of the property that the Germanna Foundation owns today all the way west. And then Thornton Cornwell and his family take the portion of the property all the way east to Thumb Run. So Craven and his wife, Sarah, they moved here with their son, John, their daughter-in-law, Lucy, listed here, and John and Lucy's family of 6 children. John and Lucy's son, Wellington, actually remains on the property. He marries a woman named Annie Walker, and that couple lived here with their children into the 1920s. And here's a few photos of some of those family members I was able to locate. Here's Wellington Gore as a younger man and Wellington Gore in his later years. And Hercelia Gore in the next picture, as well as Arthur Landon Gore, are 2 of Wellington and Annie's children. In fact, Arthur Landon Gore, this last photo, was a resident of Fauquier County who actually passed away just this year at the age of 102. and he was one of the last children of Wellington and Annie Gore to be born on the Hitt property. Between 1872 and the 1920s, there are 4 generations of the Gore family living here, and these details are very well documented through census records, deed references, as well as family history. In 1926, some of the heirs of the Gore family sold the property, their half of the property, to a man named Henry Samuel Blackwell. He was a recent widower who moved here with 3 of his children, Dandy Rosella, Annie Laurie, and John Henry. And this is a picture of Henry Samuel Blackwell with his wife prior to her death and their children. Henry lived on the property until his death in 1943, and he was buried in Amosville over in Rappahannock County next to his wife. In 1919, an African-American family, including George Henry Moore and his wife Cora, as well as their 3 children listed here, purchased the eastern half of the original Hitt lease that extended all the way over to Thumb Run. So this was not part of the land that the foundation owns today. The Moore family moved into a house, a picture of which is down here at the bottom. Let's see if I can use my pointer. Here's the house. So this is the house the Moore family moved into. And we believe that the house probably had been built by Craven Gore's cousin, Thornton Cornwell, when they split the property back in 1872. Here's some of the outbuildings that are on the property. In 1945, the Moore family actually purchases the remaining 100 acres, including the portion that the Germanna Foundation owns today, and basically reconsolidates the original Hitt lease. So in 1945, George Henry Moore owns about 200 acres, and he would have been one of the largest African-American landholders in the county at that time. George Henry Moore died in 1950, and his wife Cora died in 1966. Their son Raymond and his wife Hazel sell their half interest in the property to Raymond's sister Mary and her husband John Willie Young. And Mary and her husband own the property until 1996, when they will it to their goddaughter Patricia Jones. Okay, so that history of who has lived on the property kind of brings us back up nearly to the present. And so much of the history of the people I just mentioned is tied back to one structure in particular that still stands on the property today, this very old log house. This was arguably one of the most important features of the property when the foundation acquired it in 2017. The house had been surveyed by architectural historians for probably close to 50 years, with a lot of dispute about when it was constructed. The house itself is quite small. It's a 3-bay, 1.5-story log building with a standing seam metal roof and 2 exterior stone chimneys at both the western and the eastern ends. The entire building rests on an uncourse stone foundation. Only portions of that stone foundation still stand though. The southern facade is the one that is pictured here, you can see. We believe historically was the front of the house and today retains the highest degree of integrity. The log walls pictured here are pretty much completely intact. They have very tight V-notching, which you'll see a picture of in a second. And there's a combination of rubble stone and plaster chinking in between these logs, so you can see here. There are 2 original window frames and casings still intact here and kind of behind this tree that you can't see in this picture. There's an early batten door here, and that would have entered directly into this sort of eastern main level room. We believe it was probably the original entrance into the house, and then a later door that you can see here was cut in probably between 1872 and 1900 during the Gore family's ownership. And that would have been to reorganize the interior spatial arrangement into more of a central passage plan with 2 flanking private spaces. The northern facade, which is pictured here, we think was a later front entrance to the house based on some historical photos that we found. However, the house has suffered from many years of neglect. The log walls were taken out, and now it is structurally failing because of that. The predominant feature of the eastern side of the house is this big exterior stone chimney, which we just saw in the other picture. There was a door cut in, we think probably in the late 19th century, as well as two small windows that flank either side of the chimney in the upper half story. The western facade is pretty similar in appearance to the eastern facade, but it has no window or doors. And it was likely completely covered with this weatherboarding at one point, but now really just the top half story retains the siding. Guesses as to the age of the building have ranged widely from the mid to late 19th century, even the early 20th century. The documentary record tells us that, of course, John Hopper had a house somewhere on the property, and that the Hitt family also had a house. And of course, the land tax assessment shows a $200 improvement in Hannah Hitt's assessment, and a valuation of this amount in 1820 would have almost certainly been a substantial structure large enough to be a house. So I think we can assume that that is referring to the Hitt family's home. So a closer examination of the exterior and interior of the house found a number of interesting features that actually suggest perhaps an earlier build date. So this is an image of that V-notch that I was just mentioning to you. So the V-notch used in log construction is sometimes associated with German American log construction. In fact, Fred Niffen and Henry Glassy, in their work from the 1960s on ethnic affiliations in log construction, found that German Americans who settled in the Virginia Piedmont and the Blue Ridge actually retained the V-notch as their predominant form of corner notching. And on the inside, on the storage closet underneath the staircase, there was an original H-hinge found intact, which dates back to the early 19th century. So that was an exciting find as well. So other details from inside the house. In the top left corner, we found exposed beaded floor joists for the second story, and they were milled and not hand hewn. This bottom left corner, this is an image of one of several hand-wrought nails. This particular one, I think, was found on the staircase, and these would have been used up until the early 19th century when cut nails became predominant. And here we have the frame for a casement window in the eastern first floor room. This would have dated to the 19th century or earlier as well. So we wanted to determine whether the house was built during Peter Hitt's lease, whether it was built later into the 19th or even early 20th century, or whether it could have been constructed even earlier by John Hopper during the first lease of this land. And the clues on the outside and the inside of the house certainly suggested that possible early 19th century construction date, but we really wanted to be sure. And we had heard quite a bit about the benefits of using dendrochronology, which is tree ring dating, to find out when the logs for the house had been felled. So we hired Nick Worthington, who runs the Oxford Tree Ring Laboratory, to come out to the house. And in order for accurate core samples of the logs to be taken, those logs needed to retain some of their bark edge. And if you look at this little image here, this gives you an idea of what information different parts of the log can give you. In the middle here, that's the beginning of the tree's growth. And then having that bark edge, that tells you when the tree stopped growing. So here's a short clip. So that's what it looks like to take a core sample. Actually, I'm going to play it again because it was really quick. So that was Mick in action, coring some of the the logs from inside the Hitt house, you'll see how he angles into the wood. He's trying to get as much of that bark edge as possible and then coring deep into the middle of the wood to get that complete profile. So Mick ended up taking samples from 9 logs at different points in the house. This floor plan shows the location of each core sample that was taken, and he sort of points to each individual location. They were all on the first floor because the logs on the second floor were not in good shape. So upon analysis of those 9 core samples taken, 4 logs retained that complete sapwood, and those were highlighted in red here. All 4 of those logs produced a felling date of summer 1800. So the house would have been constructed very shortly thereafter, and in fact, it would have been standing by the fall of 1800. Those chimneys that we just saw, the stone chimneys, would have been completed over the next year or so, as was attested to in that chancery case by Henry Bonnier, when he stated that he lived with the family for 2 fall seasons while he helped them build the chimneys. So this date for the house of 1800 safely places it within the lease period for the Hitt family. So we now know that this log house was built by and for Peter Hitt. So moving on from the house and going to that, I think it was the second to last question, who was buried in the cemetery. The foundation knew very well that Peter Hitt was buried in this cemetery. But after the foundation acquired the property, I went out and took a site visit there, and it seemed to me like there was a lot of ground disturbance in the area, kind of back behind where Peter's gravesite was, suggesting that perhaps the cemetery was much larger than just the stones shown in this first row here. So step 1 in documenting the cemetery was just doing a pedestrian survey, just a walkover and a visual inspection of what was there. And of course, I noted that Peter Hitt's original inscribed stone was present, that's pictured here, along with a Revolutionary War marker that had been installed by the Culpeper chapter of the Sons of American Revolution in 1994. And then in this picture here, this was a tombstone that was installed by a group of Hitt descendants in July of 1998. This was a US government tombstone. Next to Peter Hitt's grave was a tombstone that had some faded inscription on it. And this is a picture of it here. Using shaving cream, Lori Payne with the Fauquier Family Cemetery Foundation showed me how you can put that over top of the grave to easily bring out the inscription that's not readily seen. So the shaving cream actually highlighted H. Hitt, August 25th, 1846. So marking the gravesite of Hannah Hitt, Peter's wife. After I finished this sort of visual inspection and walkover of the cemetery, I went through deed references and noted that a couple deed references mentioned a Gore family cemetery located in kind of the same general area as the Hitt graves were. So it seemed even more likely that perhaps this cemetery was larger. And one of the exciting and somewhat new technologies available is something called ground penetrating radar. And it's a non-invasive method that's sometimes used for grave detection, but it basically uses radar pulses to create an image of changes underground. I think it's more often used, and perhaps if you've heard about it, you've heard it in terms of construction. Sometimes it's used to locate underground utilities or potential hazards underground, but that same technology is sometimes successful in grave detection under the right circumstances. The age of the internment or the burial generally has a negative correlation with the image shown through the radar. So this basically just means that older graves are going to be much more difficult to detect through ground penetrating radar. However, in the case of the Hitt Cemetery, the property was relatively flat. There was no tree cover and there was very little ground debris. So it was really an ideal candidate for using this technology. We contracted with a local firm called GPRS, who brought out their GPR system. Actually, this is a picture of the technician doing some of the work right here. And in the case of this cemetery, we were fortunate to have a couple concrete examples of known burials to use to compare the anomaly profile that came through the GPR system. So relatively small anomalies were found here and here at Peter and Hannah's grave sites, but those small anomalies on the profile roughly matched 33 other small anomalies laid out in 6 distinct rows seen here. So the GPR results indicated 35 burials were present in the cemetery, and the locations of those anomalies picked up through the GPR were subsequently marked using survey grade locational data. So we have points within each of the burials, though for some of these burials, we don't know for certain where the headstones might have been once located. Here's a view of the survey data that was taken for each marked anomaly in the cemetery. Existing headstones were marked along with the set stakes, marking what are, like I said, believed to be the approximate locations of where headstones were once located. And following the GPR work, soil probing actually located a number of additional headstones that had been pushed just right under the surface. So during that soil probing, one of the most exciting discoveries was actually another inscribed headstone with the initials LR, July 31st, 1829. This person would have been connected to the Hitt family in some fashion because this date is during that family's occupation of the property. But to date, I have not been able to identify him or her. So of the 35 burials in the cemetery, we now have names or initials for at least 10 of them. We know that Peter and Hannah Hitt were among the first burials in the cemetery, along with several members of the Gore and Cornwall families. There are some question marks as to these other individuals listed below, including Ann Hopper, who would have passed away in the late 18th century, and George Henry Moore and his son, William Moore. It's possible that the Moore family had a cemetery on the eastern half of the property, although the fact that the Moore family retained this parcel with the cemetery up to 2006 suggests it could have been because their family cemetery was here as well. So now we've arrived at that last question. How was the property used historically? And it's a much more challenging question to answer from just records alone, from documentary records alone, unless you find first-person accounts or diaries or family members still alive who can share remembrances with you. In the case of this property, I haven't found those yet, although I'm still ever hopeful that they will pop up. So for the purposes of this, I had to search elsewhere, and I began with Peter Hitt's 1802 estate inventory. And when you dive deeply into the contents of it, it actually paints a really fascinating picture about life at the turn of the 19th century out on the Rappahannock River. I've extracted just a few of the items from the inventory here so you can get a better look at them, but I'll go into detail about a few of them. So it says that the family had a wooling wheel and they had 2 flax wheels. So we can surmise from this alone that they were growing some quantity of flax and they were processing that flax into fibers for linen. And here's an image of a flax wheel. They had sheep, as we can see from the inventory. So they were probably taking that wool and they were spinning it into fibers for clothing and other fabrics for the family to use. The still in tubs, which is listed here, and a drawing of what a 19th century still in tub could have looked like on the Hitt farm is here. And this is a fairly common item found on these early inventories. And the lease terms also required the planting of an apple orchard. So it's likely that the family was producing apple brandy or some type of other similar product using their still in tubs. So unfortunately, the next record that I found wasn't until the 1880 agricultural census, but this is such a rich resource and gives us so much information about the early years of the Gore family occupying the property. And one of the interesting things that I found from the 1880 census was that the family was experimenting with growing many different grain crops. So they had 1 acre of buckwheat, 25 acres of corn, 5 acres of oats, 6 acres of rye, 45 acres of wheat. And if my math is correct, that's about 82% of their total property area that was in grain production alone, which is really remarkable. They had another acre that was planted with apple trees, and there was also a small quantity of white and sweet potatoes. The family had a plethora of horses, milk cows, other cattle, sheep, hogs, chickens. You know, taken together, this suggests they were fairly comfortable middle-class farmers. They also produced 25 bushels of honey. And I found some examples of kind of late 19th century beehives to share. This one on the left here is called a shep. And this was woven, it was a woven basket beehive. And the middle here is a log beehive. And then on to the right on the end is a frame beehive. And these were all fairly commonly used. Sometimes you find clues hidden in rather unusual places. And on one of the paneled walls in the house, I found writing documenting bushels of corn stubble. Based on the handwriting and based on its location in the house, I think that this was probably from either the Gore or the Blackwell family's ownership of the property. And what's interesting is it shows us that even after the corn crop had been produced, there were 54 bushels of the crop left that could be grazed as forage, or it could be chopped into silage to be used later for fodder for animals. So here's an image taken of the property. This is just another view. Here's the Rappahannock River, and this is Taps Ford Road running here. So today, Taps Ford Road roughly makes up the western boundary of the property, but the original route of Taps Ford Road actually traverses through the property today, and it parallels this current road. Here's an image of the road, the original Taps Ford Road that's on the Hitt property today. So the original Taps Ford came down to the edge of the Rappahannock River, roughly about right here on the Hitt property, forded the river and came up the other side. So this would have been prior to the construction of the first bridge here around 1870. And so a portion of this property would have been used for regular travel, crossing back and forth between Fauquier and Rappahannock counties. And even today, as you can see, the old roadbed is fairly clear, and in the winter, you can still walk along it. As part of our overall property documentation, the foundation had a boundary survey completed for the Hitt Farm. And that also documented, as I showed earlier, all of the burials in the cemetery, the house, other cultural features. And in the wooded area to the east of the cemetery, approximately right in this location, I located various other cultural features, likely dating to the mid-20th century. They included a poured concrete slab, cinder block footings, various types of brick, probably from some mid-20th century structure. There was also quite a bit of glass around the site, suggesting perhaps the structure had windows. Then we found a concrete cap and mortared cinder block, telling us that the building had a heat source. And then the electrical box nearby told us that the building was electrified as well. So there's a lot more to be learned about this portion of the property, but I think that there's a lot of promise to tell us about the occupation of the property by the Moore family in the mid-20th century. And then lastly, there is a spring located in front of the Hitt house that appears to have probably been in continuous use up into the mid-20th century based on the addition and accumulation of more modern materials to the spring box over time. And there's certainly a lot more that we can learn about the historic use of the property by exploring the archaeological record around a lot of these different resources. So shortly after the foundation acquired this parcel with the log house in 2017, the foundation hired a local preservation firm to shore up the structure. As you saw in that one picture where it was missing its walls, it was deteriorating quite fast. So now the interior of the house has bracing, and there's also these exterior walls to make sure that there's no openings exposed to the elements. The foundation is keeping the area around the house free of trees and undergrowth. It's being regularly mowed. And then most recently, we're working with an architectural historian to have the property determined eligible for listing on the National Register. I'd like to also add the foundation is indebted to the late Russell Hitt and his wife Joan, who made preservation of this property possible through their generous contributions to the foundation. And going forward, the foundation is exploring numerous opportunities for future public access days here, and also thinking through long-term possibilities for the historic house. And we think with such a rare and beautiful property as this, the possibilities are endless. Thank you. With that, I'm happy to take any questions that anyone might have.
Hi, Kristie. Thank you so much. That was so fascinating. I've been reading comments. People are extremely fascinated as well by it. That was just so intriguing. It's an exciting venture, and all the research you did, that was wonderful. I have a lot of questions coming your way, so I'm gonna try to go down one at a time. And I have some questions of my own as well. So the first question that came in is from Mark, and he wanted to know, let's see. There was another question prior, I can't find it, I'll get to it in a minute. A lot of people were intrigued by the lease terms that you mentioned with the apple trees. Why might there have been a requirement to plant apple trees? And why would that have been the choice crop versus something else? And what would they have possibly have done with the apples?
So that is a term that I've seen on many leases, not just in the manner of leads. Apples were like a staple food source going back, centuries. And I think that best I can tell, the reason that the apple tree requirement was included in these leases was sort of to establish that as being a place that was inhabited. So they were trying to encourage people to settle parts of the country that hadn't been settled yet. And so requiring a house and requiring an orchard sort of marks that area as being a place that's now settled with people living on it.
Okay, perfect, thank you. So Mark did want to know, is James Markham Marshall related to the John Marshall born in Germantown, the third Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court?
Yes, and I would have to look at a family tree to tell you exactly what the connection is, but yes, it's the same Marshall family.
Very cool. All the history kind of intertwining at that one location. Terry Hitt would like to know, what were the social forces that promoted purchase of enslaved Blacks in small family farms per Hannah Hitt?
So you have to think back to that period around 1800 where we find the girl named Jude on Peter Hitt's inventory. At that time period, the cost of purchasing an enslaved worker was quite low. It was actually it was a much more common practice in 1800, and it wasn't until after the slave trade ended that the price of purchasing an enslaved worker actually shot up exponentially. So it was a much more common practice.
Wow. Okay, great. Thank you. Couple questions in reference to the gravestones. One person was a little confused. She wanted to know, you discovered gravestones just under the soil. Were those dug up? And if so, what was done with them?
The headstones, is she talking
Mhm.
about headstones?
Yeah.
They were literally just like peeking out from under the soil. So they were pulled up and just left right in place.
Okay. And I know there were a couple comments talking about using shaving cream on gravestones or headstones. And there was some concern, is using shaving cream really something that's good for the headstones, or what are the benefits or pitfalls of using the shaving cream?
Well, to be honest, I don't know. And Lori Payne is far more experienced in that than I. She's been doing it for a long time. I trust that she knows what she was doing, and I have seen it done elsewhere. So I do think it's probably a safe method of bringing out inscriptions on tombstones.
Okay, great. Thank you. Mark would like to know, can you tell us about your effort to locate and survey undocumented cemeteries in the broader Germanna cultural region of the Virginia Piedmont?
Yes. So some of you may have received an email from me earlier today. Through my work at the Piedmont Environmental Council, we have a fellowship program going on right now where we're sending out a survey, hoping that people will respond with cemeteries that may be located on their property or maybe a neighboring property that haven't been documented. And what this is doing, this is part of an effort to try to get more cemeteries across Virginia's Piedmont documented at the state level. So through the Department of Historic Resources Cultural Resource Inventory System, so that they can be taken into consideration anytime there's development or, clearing. Think about a new neighborhood, a new development occurring. If you know where the cemetery is, you can plan for its protection. If you don't know where it is, you can't advocate for that preservation. So that's really what the purpose of the survey was. And I encourage anyone who has received that link to submit a response if they know of a cemetery that needs to be documented.
Wonderful. Thank you. I have another question about the apples. Is there any evidence of where the required apple trees or apple orchards were planted? Are there still any fruit trees on the property?
To my knowledge, there are no fruit trees left. And you have to remember the piece that the Germanna Foundation owns today is just 11.5 acres. It was part of a 200-acre tract.
Mm-hmm.
It's certainly possible, perhaps, that there are remnants remaining somewhere else on that 200-acre piece, but I haven't seen them on the piece that the foundation owns.
Okay, great. Andrew would like to know, the lease records for the Manor of Leeds, are they in the county courthouse?
They are, and there is an excellent book that I am blanking on the name of right now. It's at the Virginiana room at the Warrenton branch of the Fauquier County Public Library that actually has indexed all of the leases and has a map for where they're located. So if you're looking in a certain area, that is, instead of you kind of looking for a needle in a haystack, that'll send you in a more direct location to get the name of the leaseholder that you're looking for.
Great. Thank you. Barb Price did want to mention that she looked it up. James Markham Marshall is the brother of Supreme Court Justice John Marshall. So we have that answered. Lynette would like to know, and I've seen this question come across Germanna a few times at the Visitor Center. We have Jost Hitt researching the Jost Hitt genealogy, heavily settled in the Shenandoah Valley with German immigrants. Is there any connection to the Peter Hitt family?
Oh goodness, I don't know. That's not really something that I delved into, and someone who is a more experienced genealogist may be able to answer that, but I cannot.
Yeah, maybe Barb Price will pop in.
Chime in, yeah.
Let's see. Let's see, after the lecture. Okay. Mark would like to know, after the lecture, could you share some sources that were helpful to you in preparing this excellent lecture? And it really was a fascinating lecture.
Sure, yeah, I could probably even take them off of one of the slides. I think I had a source slide.
Okay.
I'd be happy to share that, yeah.
Wonderful. Another question is, do you know anything about a Heimbach or Hahnbach cemetery?
Where would that be located?
I'm not sure. It was a question Mark was passing along from, I think, the chat box. And Barb Price did confirm there is no connection to the Hitt family within the Shenandoah region.
Okay.
Okay. I'm not seeing any more questions. One question I have, this may be shot in the dark. I've always been curious about those 35 burials. We know that there was Peter and Hannah, and then their 10 kids. Do we have any idea who the other, headstones might be connected to, or burial sites?
Yeah, I could, I mean, if it's helpful, I could go back to that slide where I kind of listed out the known ones.
Okay.
Actually, I don't believe any of their children. I don't believe any of Peter and Hannah Hitt's children are buried there. However, it's possible that one of their grandchildren or a couple of their grandchildren are. It seems like the bulk of the burials date back to the Gore and Cornwell family's ownership of the property. They owned it for about 50 years or so.
Okay, wonderful. All right, I'm not seeing any more questions. If you do have any questions, I know Kristie had her contact information on her last slide. I want to thank you, Kristie, for a wonderful presentation. There's so much fascinating information. And we look forward to having more information pulled from there, future public access days at the Peter Hitt Farm. So we're looking forward to that.
Well, thank you, Ashley, and I enjoyed sharing this research with everyone. It's a fun ongoing project.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much.